Yeah, hello everybody. So my name's Caine Barlow. Yes, I'm a mycologist and a fungi educator. I recently finished my master's degree in conservation mycology, looking at creating preliminary threat assessments for a variety of different Australian species. My talk today is on Australian Psilocybe and their lookalikes. I also got Simon Beck online from PMANS. So many of you will probably know us from that Facebook group, and he's going to be fielding some of the questions and helping moderate. So Australian Psilocybe is one of my favourite, it's my favourite genus, or one of. So I'm going to go through Australian species and their lookalikes. Okay, so Australia can be broken up into two different regions when it comes to the genus Psilocybe. We have the subtropical and tropical regions and the temperate region. So the subtropical and tropical species are Psilocybe cubensis and Psilocybe papuana. Papuana we don't know a whole lot about, but there's some fascinating posts on Shroomery about it. Cubensis we all know, it's the gold top that everyone's familiar with up in Queensland and northern New South Wales. In temperate regions, we have Psilocybe suberugosa, which is the most common in our region. We also have Psilocybe Alocasia, which has recently become a lot more well known, and Psilocybe stemmelanceata. So everybody's favourite in Southeast Australia and Southwest Australia, WA, is Psilocybe suberugosa. Its habitat is wet, dry eucalypt forests. It also grows in eucalypt and pine plantations and is quite commonly found in wood-chipped garden beds. Its distribution is from the far south of Tasmania. In fact, I think the most southern observation was on Massacre Island, which is the most southern landfall. It's found through Victoria, New South Wales, southwest WA, where it's an introduced species, and in the last 10 years, it's making more of an appearance in southeast Queensland. It requires the cold. It requires consistent nights of 5 to 6 degrees. It either needs lots of good heavy dews, or in more drier regions, it needs a good rain to trigger the fruiting. Seasons vary according to the geography as well. In Tasmania, you might get a season starting as early as March, but the season is generally April, May, to June, July. Most spots tend to get 3 to 4 flushes max, and those flushes are dependent on the availability of nutrients. The distinctive features is that brown hygrophonous cap that you can get really dark chocolate coloured caps to caps like on the slide now, nice yellow colour. The hygrophonous cap, though, when it starts to dry out, it loses that viscousness and the whole cap will dry to yellow. The firm white fibrous stem, which turns grey with age, is also very distinctive. You can just see it from miles away when you know what you're looking for. All parts of the fungus bruise blue when they're damaged. It's very, very good identifying feature. Some other mushrooms do bruise blue, but they look quite different. Like some of the bollies that bruise blue, you're not going to really confuse the two. The white partial veil is also quite distinctive. You can see it in the smaller specimen there, and that can disappear completely, or sometimes it leaves a trace around the margin of the cap. Again, as you can see in the larger specimen. The spore print is a dark violet to black, and in some cases brown, but the brown is very rare and is usually the result of a genetic mutation. The gills, they're quite crowded. They're a cream colour when young, and they go a grey-brown as they get older. They are adnate to adnex attachment, and sometimes, very rarely, you'll find sterile specimens where the gills remain white, regardless of the age. The cap can be anywhere between 1 to 6 centimetres in diameter. That's a very, very average measurement. You can get quite large specimens, and you can also get quite small specimens. The caps are usually conical to convex, and they uplift as they get older. You can see in the bottom right-hand picture the uplifting. This is one of the features that is quite often confused with, say, Psilocybe cyanescens. The cap can start off tan brown, and as I already mentioned, with age it tends to go yellow, and in some cases even white. The margin is striate when moist, and again that feature is kind of harder to see when it dries. And it often has a slight umbo, and in some cases it has a really quite distinct umbo. Sometimes it disappears almost completely. It's just a rounded cap. The stipe, or stem, is, as mentioned, distinctively white. So the mushrooms can be 4.5 to 22 centimetres high. Again, that's quite an average figure. And they're about 0.2 to 0.5 centimetres thick. They're very fibrous. Like, you can bend them. They're quite strong. Again, quite white in colour, and they turn grey with age. In some cases, say around like this time of year, the stems go quite brown. They become quite waterlogged, and yeah, I probably should have included an example of that. The base can sometimes enlarge when it is near the ground. Here are 3 specimens. You can see there on the right specimen that enlargement in the base. You can see probably a slight little bit of waterlogging there with the brown colours and the grey. Again, there's that bluing on the stem, the gorgeous white colour, and the yellow cap. You can see here also the quite white, light coloured gills. And in the specimen on the right, it's got bruising on the gills as well. So, Suberogenosa lookalikes. This photo on the right here is fantastic. You can see Loradiomyces ceres growing right next door to Psilocybe suberogenosa. You can also get Galerinas growing in a similar environment. So you need to be really careful when picking your mushrooms that you do observe each specimen. So the lookalikes are Galerina species, Hypholoma species, Cortinarius, Polyota, in some cases Protostropharia semiglobata, Gymnopilus, and Loradiomyces ceres. Let's have a look through some of these. So the Galerina species, probably the most common you're going to come across is Galerina patagonica. It's a wood and moss inhabiting fungus, so a very, very similar habitat to Suberogenosa. The cap is brown, it's hygrophonous, and in the same way as Suberogenosa, it turns a lighter brown yellow colour as it starts to dry out. There's that central umbo, but one of the distinctive differences is the pale brown to grey stem. It's quite a difference between that beautiful white coloured stem of the Suberognosa. It also has an annulus. It's quite often present, but it can get knocked off during weather events. So, but it should have a scar that you can see. The spore print is rusty brown. It's quite a distinctive difference. You should be able to see spores deposited on either the annulus or the stem. Here's another example of Galerina patagonica. You can see the annulus, but you can see that the colours are quite variable between the caps. There are other Galerina species. They generally have the same kind of features. They grow on wood, amongst moss, and often in clusters. The rusty brown spore print is quite distinctive. They do tend to be relatively small, but not tiny. And again, yes, pointing out the annulus, which may or may not be present. Some species of Galerina don't have an annulus, so it's always good to kind of check for spore deposits. And again, just pointing out that the cap is brown, going to tawny, and the colour fades with age because of that hygroscopic cap. Here's an example of possibly Galerina marginata or unicolor. This photo is a really good example. There's a specimen there that's been sliced open, but you can see that brown cap, you can see the umbo, and you can see how it can be confused with Suberognosa. Another one that's quite oftenly picked and confused is Hypholoma fascicular. It grows in clusters. The cap is approximately 6 centimetres in diameter, sulphur yellow colour. It tends to have a red, orange, brown centre with a whitish margin. So you can see in that photo the colours change from the umbo through to the margin, that brown going through to white or sulphury yellow. The gills tend to be a greenish yellow, becoming grey with age. The stipe is a white yellow colour. They tend to be 10 centimetres tall. The stipe tends to be about 1 centimetre wide. The stems do tend to turn a reddish brown towards the base of the stem. In this case, with Hypholoma, the spore print is purple-brown, so it starts to kind of look a little bit like the Suberognosa print. So even though doing a spore print is a good idea, it doesn't necessarily 100% distinguish between the lookalikes. So here is Hypholoma fascicular. You can see that sulphur yellow colour. You can see the orange and the browns in that central area of the cap. You can see the yellow and the slight green tint of the gills and that kind of purpley brown colour of the base of the stem. Here's another Hypholoma species. There are quite a few, but they tend to have kind of similar characteristics. So, so that beautiful white stem, but then turns sort of purpley brown near the base, and that kind of green colour of the gills. Once you know it, you can see it quite easily. Cortinarius species, these are the ones that kind of worry me. There are many lookalike species within the genus Cortinarius. It's a huge genus covering Australia, New Zealand, South America. They are quite easily mistaken because of the brown caps, and a lot of them are also purple in colour. And the tricky thing is that purple colour gets leached out, so people pick these thinking that The purple or what looks blue is actually bruising. So it can be very confusing for people who are new to foraging. So it's a good idea to really familiarise yourself with the variety of Cortinarius out there. They tend to have a thick, kind of woody, but sometimes fragile stem. One of the distinctive features is the veil that protects the gills in the younger specimens. You can kind of see them sitting down off the stem with the gills showing. The spores are rust brown in colour, and you can see that then the spores being deposited on that veil and on the stem. So this is Cortinarius ostrovenitus. You can see how from the top it might be confusing, but then looking at the gills, that bright yellow colour, and then if you were to look at the stem, no doubt you'd find lots of brown spores being deposited. The most common one that comes up in the groups that I ID in is Cortinarius rotundasporus. Particularly when it starts to dry out or when it gets leached with colour, it can look a little confusing. But some of the distinctive features are the metallic blue and the smooth glutinous layer that's on the top of the cap. When I get to the next slide, you'll be able to see. The caps tend to be about average 7 centimetres in diameter. They're a metallic blue in colour. They have a yellow-brown or orange centre. The gills have a really distinctive pinkish or violet when they're young. So if we compare it to, say, the Australis that has that kind of white, yellowy colour gill that then turns a grey-brown with age, you can start to see the differences. The stipe is 14 centimetres long. It can be bluish in colour. And with a glutinous layer on the stipe. So I've just been given a question. Do Hypholoma fasciculata bruise blue? They don't, but they can have a kind of a slight green colour to them, which I guess in the shade in dark areas could be confused as maybe a slight blue, but no, they don't bruise blue. So back to rotundasporus. The stem does tend to thicken as it approaches the ground. So it's on average about 1 centimetre wide, the mid-steep, and to 2 centimetres wide at the base. And here is Cortinarius rotundasporus in a bit better view. So you can see that brown in the centre of the cap. In this case, that central mushroom doesn't have that metallic blue so much. It looks kind of a little bit white. It could be confused for a Asparaginnosa. But if you look on the stem, you can see the brown spore deposits where the veil would have been. You can also see how much the stem thickens as it gets near the ground on those smaller specimens on the left. This one is always found in the same spots as Asparaginnosa. This is Loradiomyces ceres, commonly referred to as the woodchip cherry. It's a really good indicator species. It means that it's the perfect condition for Asparaginnosa. So you might find these in a spot 1 week, come back a couple of weeks later, and you might find Asparaginnosa growing nearby. So keep an eye out for them. The cap is orange-red. It's often scaly, but these scales can get washed off in the weather. They are the veil remnants. There's also veil remnants at the margin and on the surface of the cap. The gills have a very distinct greyish, kind of almost bluish colour if you see it in the right light, which is very different from Asparaginnosa. The stem, they tend to be about 10 centimetres tall, and the stem is about maybe 4 millimetres wide. Again, average. They can grow a little bit thicker and chunkier. And the stem will quite often have a orange-red to pale yellow coloration near the base of the stem. And they can look like they bruise blue, which is probably the result of spore deposits on the stem. So the spore print, again, is purplish black. So it's a very similar colour to Seborrheicosa. So if you're going on spore print alone, again, that's going to cause confusion. Here's an example of Seborrheicosa growing right next to Loradiomyces ceres. So if you're out collecting, you may happen to gather one as part of your foraging. Polyota species, I'm going to cover these generally. They are a wood inhabiting or soil inhabiting mushroom. You'll find them in the same kind of habitat as Seborrheicosa. The cap, though, has a scaly texture to it, but when it's moist, it can look really slimy. So if you're going by texture, you might kind of confuse that texture. The gills are attached. The stem, it also has varying amounts of orange-brown scales, similar to what's on the cap. A veil is present in young specimens, and with age, though, they just turn into remnants in the form of scales on the stem. The spore print is a dull brown with a hint of rust, so akin to Cortinarius or Galerinas. And you should be able to see those spore deposits on the stem in older specimens. This is just another example of the Polyota. You can see here those kind of really bright yellow gills, quite distinctive. But if you were collecting in like a dark light, you might quite easily confuse the two, or confuse with Seborrheicosa. Protostropharia semiglobata. These do get confused, particularly if people are collecting around woodlands where there's lots of grass and lots of dung. These grow singly or sometimes in small colonies on herbivore dung. They do tend to be quite common. The cap is about 40 millimetres wide. They're quite hemispherical. It's a very distinctive feature of semiglobata. The surface is smooth and quite viscid. They feel really quite slimy. The gills start out pale. They become darker and quite black with age. So if you find older specimens, yeah, the gills are quite dark in colour. And you'll find that by that age, the stems are quite fragile and they break quite easily. So for the stem, they're tall, they're smooth, viscid, and there tends to be a spore deposit on the veil remnants, a little bit way down the stem from the cap. The spore print is a purple-black. So Protostropharia used to be in the Stropharia family, so it used to be referred to as Stropharia semiglobata. So if you're using some of the older ID guides, it would be referred to in Stropharia. Okay, moving on to Psilocybe Alocasia. This is a fairly more recently known species. It was discovered fairly recently and described, and even though a few people kind of knew about the paper and its occurrence, it wasn't being found very often. But earlier in the 2010s, people started finding it a lot, and now it's being found to be quite cosmopolitan, it seems. So its habitat is wet and dry eucalypt forests. It tends to grow on animal dung, so wombat, I believe maybe also wallaby, and I think it's also been found growing on horse dung. So yeah, it gets around a little bit. It's been found in Tasmania and Victoria. It was originally discovered in Tasmania. So, but yeah, now being found in Victoria. And curious whether people are finding it in New South Wales. Be kind of cool to know. We seem to think it requires the cold and moisture, but we're not 100% certain. We're still trying to identify its seasonal ranges. I think this year's been quite an odd year because the season started so early. I seem to recall there was an observation in February, but we would imagine that the season is probably from March to July. The cap is kind of small, 13 millimeters, conical or convex, and hygrophonous. It's striate, which is quite a common feature in Psilocybe. It has a leathery brown colour or ochraceous brown. The gills are adnate, becoming greyish brown. Stem, 46 millimeters tall, 2.5 millimeters wide, cylindrical, pale brown in colour, quite fibrous, and there's that bruising feature. They bruise blue occasionally when damaged. Here's another example next to a 5-cent coin. You can see that they can be quite small. Moving on to Psilocybe semilanceata. This is an introduced species. It grows in open grassland. It tends to grow on decomposing grass, quite often found in, say, horse runs or cattle pastures. Its habitat tends to be is Tasmania and Victoria. Not sure if it's been found in New South Wales. We know it occurs in New Zealand, and it's very cosmopolitan in the Northern Hemisphere where it was introduced from. It seems to require the cold. And it tends to come on with the beginnings of those heavy dews that you get in March. It appears to have 2 seasons. So one season going from March to May, and then the other season is August to October. The specimens on the right were found in October in Tasmania. They have a very distinctive cap. So the cap is 5 to 25 millimeters in diameter, 6 to 22 millimeters tall. They are sharply conical to bell-shaped. They're hygrophonous with a very prominent papilla, which is the nipple-shaped structure at the top of the cap. The margin unrolls and it can remain straight, or it can actually curl outwards. So it can curl out like that and look like a little, I guess why it's referred to as pixie caps. The caps can be pale brown to dark chestnut in colour, with the occasional greenish blue tinge to them. Because they're hygrophonous, when they dry, they become a light yellow-brown colour. The gills are crowded. They are narrowly admixed to almost free attachments, initially pale brown, becoming dark grey to purple brown. The stipe is slender, yellowish brown, 45 to 140 millimetres by about 1 to 3.5 millimetres thick. They are slightly thicker towards the base, and it's at the base that you quite often find the blue bruising. The blue bruising. The stem is really, really thick, one of the identifying features that you can wrap it around your finger and it won't break, whereas some other species will. Also with Simulanciata, the other Psilocybe have this feature as well, but I found it's quite easy to remove on Simulanciata other than other Psilocybes, is the pellicle. It's a sticky surface that results from a thin gelatinous film. If you break the cap, you can stretch it out a little bit. You'll be able to see it in the next photo. Again, all parts of the mushroom will bruise blue if injured. Here is that separable pellicle. You can see it stretching out across the cap. You can do this with Australian as well. I've not really been able to manage it very well myself, but there are some really good photos of it. But yes, it's a really good identifying feature of Psilocybe if you can get it to work. The Alocasia and Simulancia lookalikes tend to be Diconica, Paniolus, and Protostropharia semiglobata. So this is Diconica. You can see from the previous photo of Alocasia, they look very, very similar indeed. So the cap is 1.0 to 2.5 centimeters wide, hemispheric. Sometimes they have a slight umbo. They are hygrophonous, reddish brown in colour to dingy yellowish brown. The gills are adnate, pale grey when young, becoming greyish brown, and finally purple brown as they get older. Diconica used to be very, very closely associated with Psilocybe, hence why they quite often get confused. The stem is 1.5 to 5 centimetres long, about 1.0 to 3 millimetres thick, whitish to dingy yellow-brown, and there is no blue bruising. And Paniolus. Some Paniolus are active, but in my experience, a lot that you find in the same region as Simulanciata, you're not really going to find the bluing ones. The caps tend to be 1.5 to 3 centimetres across, conic to convex. Their colour is brown to tan, and they're hygrophonous. So they have that brown colour. As they dry, they can become quite white in colour. The gills are adnate, brown with lighter edges, becoming mottled as the spores mature. If you look close enough, you can see some of the mottling on some of the gills. The stem is 4 to 6 centimetres long by 2 to 3 millimetres wide. They're quite fragile, they're hollow, white to light brown, and slightly striate. The spore print is a dark brown to black colour. We're just going to go through Psilocybe cubensis very briefly. So this is Psilocybe cubensis. The distinctive features of the smooth hygrophonous cap, universal veil remnants that can remain on the cap. You can see this quite distinctively in this photograph. They have a white fibrous stem that turns grey with age. The flesh is whitish when you break it open, and as with other Psilocybe, they bruise blue. The spore print is dark violet to black, occasionally brown. Another feature is the annuals that you can see in the photo. The caps could be quite large, 2 to 8 centimetres in diameter, conic to convex, broad to convex to plain with age. Red to brown when young, golden yellow with age. The margin tends to be even. And an umbo that may or may not be retained with age. The gills are close, narrow to slightly wider at the centre. pallid to grey, dark purple to black with age. They can be quite mottled and the edge remaining whitish. And their attachment is adnate to adnext. Their stipe, 4 to 15 centimetres long, and 0.5 to 3.8 centimetres thick. You can find quite sort of thin stipes, and you can find quite thick ones. They tend to be white and turn yellowish with age. They can have a persistent annulus, but they can get knocked off with weather or movement. And the flesh bruises blue when injured. So Cabensis lookalikes. I'm only going to cover these by name. I'm not going to give any descriptions or examples due to time restrictions. But they can be easily confused with some Stropharia species, Sathurella Galliana, Rotonda, and Agrossaby species. Because they're introduced, they tend to be in a very specific environment, so it's hard to really confuse them with other species. Okay, useful Australian field guides. This tends to be a question that comes up quite a lot, so I'm going to cover briefly some of the better ones. So a field guide to Australian fungi, a field guide to Tasmanian fungi by Gates and Rokowski. So the field guide to Australian fungi is Bruce Fuhrer. Then there's also Fungi Flip by Gates, Rokowski and Wiltshire. There is Australian Subtropical Fungi by McMullen, Fisher, Lennon and Gard. There is a field guide to the fungi of Australia by Tony Young, and Fungi Down Under by Gray and Gray. And that's published by FungiMap, so if you'd like to support FungiMap, I'd recommend buying it. I don't know if this is going to show on the screen. It does show on the screen, but I have to place it there. If you want something that's really nice and in-depth, really good kind of guide to overall taxonomy of fungi, this is quite good. Roger Phillips, Mushrooms. It's not Australian in focus, it's UK in focus, which is why I haven't included it in the list. And here's the photos of the covers. My preference is the Bruce Fuhrer and the Gates and Rokowski. I also like my Fungi Flip, it's fantastic. Websites and Facebook groups that are of interest and that cover these fungi in a lot more detail than I can cover here. So we've got the Shroomery, Mycotopia. There are Facebook groups, so there's PMANS and PMANS ID only. There's also Psilocybe Fungi Hunters Australia and New Zealand, Psilocybe Mushroom Foragers Australia and New Zealand, and Psilocybe Tribe Australia and New Zealand. I assume many of you are probably members of at least one of those groups. I mention iNaturalist because it's a really good way of learning to not only record your observations, but also get your fungi identified. And as part of that process, it helps contribute data to fungi conservation. So that's the end of my presentation, and now question time. Okay, so are all Psilocybe varieties safe? Yes, they are. There are no poisonous Psilocybe varieties out there. So just make sure that you've identified it down to that particular genus. You should be fine. Doesn't mean that everything that bruises blue is. There are lots of different compounds that do bruise blue when they're exposed to oxygen. So there's the bruising boletes, so to speak. There's also some mycenas that bruise blue. And I think there's also some inosebes that also bruise blue. What steps would he follow to ensure he was getting psilocybes? Know your species. It's important to know the features not only of the mushrooms that you're looking for, but also know the features of the mushrooms that you're not looking for. I look at each specimen as I pick. I make sure that those particular features are there. If I'm confused by any oddities, I might put it aside in a bag, separate from the other specimens. If I was really curious, I would probably do a spore print. But yeah, it's really about knowing features. Once you become really familiar with a lot of these species, it's when you find them, you tend to know that you found them. Okay, next question. I would like to ask what Caine's opinion are on whether the wood-loving silos in Australia have been here for thousands of years or have some recently arrived here. We know that cubensis and semilanceata are introduced. Papuana, we don't know. When it comes to Suberogenosa, yeah, that's a tricky question. It would be really cool if someone out there started off the field of paleomycology and kind of did that analysis. My own feeling is that they have been here for thousands of years. There is a strong genetic relationship with Psilocybe varroa in New Zealand, and there's this kind of what's been labelled as the subsectoides feature, which you can see in the odd Australian Suberogenosa and in the odd New Zealand Suberogenosa. And also in the varroa species itself. They're not fully truffled yet. Some of them just are still a cap formation. So that to me is fairly good evidence that they have been here for a long time. The fact that they eat lots of, that their prime habitat tends to be eucalypt, and I've seen them go through piles of eucalypt sawdust like crazy. So,
so are Psilocybe lookalikes seriously dangerous?
Yes. Some of them are quite dangerous. The Galerinas are poisonous. Hypholomas are poisonous. Cortinarius are poisonous. There have been many cases, going back 20 years ago, it was a regular thing in Tasmania that people would get poisoned from Cortinarius. And people have lost kidneys and had liver damage through consuming Cortinarius species. So you do need to be really careful. If you are going to go forage, do it in daylight when you can really see the difference between the specimens that you're collecting. How does mushroom conservation work? Are people trying to populate areas the way they are with tree planting? This is a fairly new science. The idea of applying fungi back to a damaged environment. There are no studies really covering this yet. So in my case, my research was essentially just looking at where fungi occur, their distributions, in order to then make a threat assessment. But those assessments would then help lead to, okay, we need to spread this species back to where we think it should exist. But see, yeah, there's a lot of research that needs to be done there, because maybe a fungus shouldn't exist in just any kind of wet or dry sclerophyll forest. For example, Suberogenosa, there's stories of people going out with spray guns spraying Suberogenosa spores. into areas maybe where they weren't. That might cause problems with some of the indigenous fungi that are there. And if you haven't got a fungi fillet, they're great. This is it. And it folds out to this ridiculously huge sheet of fungi. I definitely recommend it if you can see it through the psychedelicness. Cool. If you do have any other questions, feel free to put them on PMANs or other Facebook groups, and I can answer them there. And thank you for joining in. Thank you, EGA, for having me.
Thank you for
a pleasure and a privilege.
our mycological guide for this afternoon.